The morning light spilled through the cracked blinds, stretching across the tiny kitchen like a thief sneaking in. Margaret Hayes stood by the counter, her thin fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold. She wasn't really drinking it, just holding on, as if the warmth could steady the tremor that had started in her hands an hour ago when she saw the number on the screen. 0. A perfect, merciless 0 staring back from the bank app. At first, she thought her eyes were fooling her. She blinked, refreshed the page, even logged out and back in. But the number didn't change. Every cent, every dime she had scraped together over a lifetime of double shifts, empty fridges, and quiet sacrifices, it was gone. She let out a small sound, not quite a sob, not quite a breath. She had known heartbreak before, the kind that leaves a woman hollow but still walking. But this felt different. This was betrayal that wore her son's face. Her phone lay on the table beside the mug. The glass screen reflected her tired eyes as she scrolled through the transactions. Large wire transfers, one after another, until nothing remained. Each line ended with the same name. Nathaniel Hayes. Her only son. Her throat closed. For a moment she thought she might faint, but she forced herself to breathe. Slowly, she reached for her phone and dialed the bank. A robotic voice told her to press 1 for English, then 2 for lost cards. The repetition was absurdly calm, and by the time a human voice answered, something in her had already cracked. "I didn't authorize these," she said, the words trembling out of her. "Ma'am," came the woman's polite but distant tone, "the transfers were made from your account credentials. Online authorization from your registered device. The activity matches your IP address. Can you tell me where the money went?" A pause, the faint click of keys. "Yes, ma'am. It was transferred to an account under the name Nathaniel Hayes." Margaret's lips moved, but no sound came. She hung up before the woman could say more. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a car passed playing a muffled song about love. Everything felt strangely slow. She moved to the small window and stared out at the street where she had lived for 35 years. A man was walking his dog. A group of teenagers laughed by the bus stop. The world was still turning, unaware that hers had just stopped. Then her phone buzzed. A message from her neighbor, Carol. "Girl, have you seen Nathan's Instagram? He's in Paris. Can you believe that? Him, that fancy wife of his, and her mama. Lord, they live in large. Paris." Margaret opened the app, her fingers trembling so hard she nearly dropped the phone. She rarely used social media, but she followed Nathan quietly, the way someone watches an old movie that once made them happy. And there he was, her boy, smiling in front of the Eiffel Tower, champagne glass raised, his arm around his wife, Clara. Next to them stood Beatrice, Clara's mother, the woman who once told Margaret her clothes smelled like work. The caption read, "Paris. New beginnings. We deserve this." Clara had commented, "Couldn't have done it without you, Mom Redheart, money with wings." For a long time, Margaret didn't move. Her eyes blurred until the faces on the screen melted together. Then she smiled, just barely. But it wasn't the soft, maternal smile that had comforted Nathan through every scraped knee and fever. It was a quiet, cold smile, one that belonged to someone who had finally stopped pretending the world was fair. She placed the phone down gently on the counter, as if afraid it might explode. Her knees felt weak. She sank into the old recliner by the window, the one she bought the year Nathan turned 10, with money she earned cleaning other people's houses. She could still remember how he had bounced on it that day, laughing, shouting, "This is ours, Mom!" And she believed him. Her gaze drifted to the shelf above the TV. Photos lined it like a timeline of someone else's life. Nathan at 5, holding a wooden toy truck. Nathan at 12, wearing a cheap Halloween costume she had sewn by hand. Nathan at 21, cap and gown, his smile stretching wide enough to make her forget every ache in her back. Every single picture was proof that she had loved him the way no one else ever would. When she finally stood, the sky outside had already dimmed into the color of ash. She opened a drawer and pulled out an old notebook, the one she used to jot down grocery lists and phone numbers. On a blank page, she wrote slowly, her handwriting crooked from the tremor that wouldn't leave her. "He didn't just take my money. He took the part of me that still believed love can't betray. She set the pen down and stared at the words until they blurred. Across the ocean, Nathan sat in a glittering restaurant overlooking the Seine, a candle flickering between him and Clara. The waiter poured more wine. Clara laughed too loudly. Beatrice reached for the breadbasket, her rings catching the light. "To new beginnings," Clara said, raising her glass. "To smarter choices," Beatrice added. Nathan smiled weakly. His stomach twisted as he glanced out the window. The Eiffel Tower sparkled on the hour, thousands of lights flickering like guilt itself. He tried to drown it in another sip of wine, telling himself it was fine, that he'd fix things later somehow. But some debts can't be repaid. Back home, the street outside Margaret's house had grown quiet. She turned off the lights and stood in the dark, her reflection faint in the window. She didn't cry. She had run out of tears years ago. The silence felt heavy, almost alive, but she didn't shy away from it. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. She boiled water for tea, chamomile, and waited for it to whistle. The sound filled the small kitchen like a memory. She sat down again, notebook still open. The moonlight caught the edge of the page, and she whispered to herself, almost smiling, "You taught me to survive, Nathan. But you forgot. I was surviving long before you were born." And in that whisper, something inside her hardened, not with anger, but with purpose. Thousands of miles away, Nathan's laughter faded when he checked his phone. A notification blinked at the top of the screen. Account frozen due to suspicious activity. He frowned, confused. Clara was still talking, her voice a blur. He didn't notice the shadow crossing his mother's face at that same moment, as she turned off the light and whispered, "Now it begins." The house went quiet. The night outside stretched endlessly, as if even the stars were holding their breath. The next morning arrived without mercy. The sun rose, but it brought no warmth. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the same cracked surface that had seen years of meals for two, now marked by the absence of conversation. Her eyes were open, but she hadn't slept. The night had passed in fragments, flashes of Nathan's face as a child, his voice calling her mama, his laughter echoing through a home that once felt alive. She thought of the promises he made, and the way they had turned to ash. The old clock on the wall ticked, steady as a heartbeat. Margaret turned to it and whispered, "I gave you everything I had." Her voice didn't tremble this time. It was calm, stripped bare of emotion. The kind of calm that follows after the last tear has dried. She stood, walked to the cabinet, and took out the small metal box where she kept important papers, bills, insurance slips, her late husband's divorce documents. Beneath the pile lay something she hadn't touched in years, the business card of Richard Carter, a retired lawyer who had once lived down the street. He had helped her once, long ago, when she almost lost the house after Frank left. Margaret traced the faded ink with her finger. Then, quietly, she dialed the number. When Richard answered, his voice was older, slower, but still kind. "Maggie Hayes? I'll be damned. Haven't heard from you in years." "I need your help," she said simply. He heard something in her tone that made him sit up. "What's wrong?" "My son took everything." There was a silence on the other end, the kind that stretches too long to be comfortable. "You mean?" "Yes," she said. "All of it. My savings, my account. It's gone." Richard exhaled slowly. "Come by my office this afternoon. Don't bring anything except the papers. We'll figure it out." Margaret thanked him, hung up, and looked around the kitchen. The air felt still, like the moment before a storm. For years, she had been small, quiet, unseen. But now, for the first time in her life, she felt the faint hum of control. She dressed in her best clothes, a faded blue dress, and the gray coat Nathan had bought her 5 birthdays ago, back when he still pretended to care. She looked at herself in the mirror. The woman who stared back wasn't soft anymore. Her eyes were tired but steady. Her back was straight. She picked up her purse and left the house. Richard's office was a dusty space above a closed-down hardware store. He looked even older than she remembered, his hair completely white, his glasses slipping down his nose. But his handshake was firm, and his eyes still sharp. She handed him the printouts of her bank statements. He read them slowly, frowning. "These are all recent transfers. To your son's account." "Yes. And you didn't sign or authorize any of it." "I barely know how to use that app," she said quietly. But the system says it was from my phone. He nodded. Could be forgery. Or maybe someone used your information without consent. Either way, it's fraud. But, he hesitated, glancing at her. Are you sure you want to go down this road? If you report it, it'll be a criminal case. Your son could. I'm not sure of anything, she interrupted softly. Except that I'm done being invisible. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying her face. Then he smiled, just faintly. You always had more fire than people gave you credit for. I just learned to hide it, she said. They spent the next hour going over documents, discussing options. He promised to start an investigation through the bank and the fraud department, but Margaret's mind was already somewhere else. She didn't want to destroy Nathan. She wanted him to see her, to understand what he had done. But deep down, she knew men like him didn't see until the lights went out. When she left the office, the afternoon sky was gray, heavy with the threat of rain. She stopped by the bakery on the corner and bought a single slice of apple pie. It had always been Nathan's favorite. She carried it home wrapped in paper, untouched. By evening, she sat again at her kitchen table, the pie still in front of her. She thought about Paris, about Nathan and Clara laughing under glittering lights, about Beatrice's smug smile. She could almost hear Clara's voice, sweet and poisonous. She's old, Nathan. She doesn't need that money. We do. Think of our future. Margaret's fingers clenched around the edge of the table. She didn't scream. Instead, she took out her notebook again and began to write. This time, it wasn't just a thought. It was a list. Step 1, retrieve what's mine. Step 2, make him remember who I am. That night, she couldn't sleep again. The rain began softly against the window, the sound rhythmic, like breathing. She closed her eyes and thought back to when Nathan was 5, sitting at the kitchen floor, drawing airplanes with a crayon. One day, I'll take you flying, Mama, he had said. She had smiled and kissed the top of his head. As long as you take me with you, she'd whispered. But he hadn't taken her. He had left her grounded, with nothing but memories and empty accounts. The next morning, she received a call from the bank. A polite voice informed her that an official inquiry had begun, and her account had been frozen pending investigation. Margaret thanked them. She knew Nathan would receive the same notice. She imagined his face when he saw it, the confusion, the panic, and for the first time in days, a small, satisfied warmth spread through her chest. Far away, Nathan was standing in the lobby of a Paris hotel, phone in hand, frowning. Clara, my account's locked. They said something about suspicious activity. Clara barely looked up from her mirror. It's probably just a system thing, she said, applying lipstick. Relax. You worry too much. I can't access anything, he muttered. Not even my cards. It's all blocked. Beatrice appeared from the adjoining room, adjusting her pearl earrings. Maybe the bank caught on. You did move a lot of money at once. Nathan's pulse quickened. It wasn't that much. Beatrice's smirk deepened. $80,000 is enough to make noise, dear. Clara sighed, rolling her eyes. Let him handle it, Mom. Nathan, just call the bank tomorrow. We got dinner reservations tonight. Don't ruin the trip. Nathan nodded weakly, but the unease in his stomach grew heavier. He tried to shake it off, but the image of his mother's face lingered in the back of his mind, the way she had smiled when he told her he was moving out. A soft, sad smile that didn't ask him to stay. Back in Eastwood, Margaret brewed a pot of coffee and sat by the window, watching the street come alive. She didn't know exactly what she would do next, but she knew she wasn't finished. There were calls to make, papers to sign, and truths to bring into the light. But more than that, she had patience. Pain had taught her how to wait. That night, she looked through an old shoebox of letters, report cards, birthday cards, one Father's Day card Nathan had made for her when he was little because you're both Mama. She held it in her lap for a long time, tracing the uneven handwriting. She didn't cry. She only whispered, "You'll remember me, Nathan. You'll remember what it means to love someone who never stopped loving you." Outside, the rain began again, steady and endless, washing the city clean. Margaret woke before dawn again. The house was silent, except for the creak of the floorboards as she moved from room to room, collecting what little she had left of her son's presents. A photo in a cheap silver frame, a sweater he had forgotten years ago, a stack of letters she had never mailed to him. She placed them all inside a box and tied it with an old ribbon. Then she opened the window, letting the cool air of early morning touch her face. The air felt different now, sharper, cleaner, almost like it carried a purpose. She made herself a cup of tea and sat by the table waiting. She had been waiting for years. She thought, for something, forgiveness, redemption, maybe just an ending. But this morning felt like the beginning of something else entirely. The silence was no longer suffocating, it was patient. By mid-morning, she received a call from Richard. His voice was cautious. "Maggie, we found some things." The bank confirmed unauthorized access from an IP address in Paris. "It's clearly fraud. You'll need to file an official complaint. Are you ready for that?" Margaret smiled faintly, though he couldn't see her. "I've been ready for years," she said. He paused. "You should know, once this starts, it might make things very difficult for him." Her voice softened. "It already is." She hung up and sat in silence for a long moment, staring at her hands. They were trembling slightly. She wasn't sure if it was from fear, anger, or something in between. Then she stood, walked to the mirror again, and looked at herself. The woman in the reflection was the same, but her eyes had changed. They no longer searched for kindness. They searched for meaning. Far across the ocean, the world around Nathan was beginning to crumble in quiet, almost invisible ways. The hotel had refused to extend their stay because the card declined again. Clara was furious. "You said you had it under control, Nathan." "You promised," she snapped, her voice echoing off the polished marble walls. "I'm trying," he said, running a hand through his hair. "It's not my fault they froze the accounts. They're investigating something." Beatrice sat in the corner, calmly stirring her coffee. "Of course they are. That's what happens when you take money that doesn't belong to you." Nathan turned to her, eyes flashing. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, but I do," she said, smiling faintly. "Clara tells me everything. And you were foolish enough to think you could outsmart everyone, even your own mother. I may not have liked the woman, but she raised you better than this." Clara shot her mother a sharp look. "Mom, please." Beatrice stood, adjusting her coat. "No, dear. You wanted a man who could provide, and you picked one who steals from his own family. Maybe you two deserve each other." Nathan's face burned. "Get out," he hissed. Beatrice tilted her head, amused. "Gladly." She walked out, her heels clicking like a metronome of judgment. Clara sank into a chair, staring at her husband. "You've ruined everything," she said quietly. "I'll fix it," he muttered, though he didn't believe it. "I'll call the bank. You don't even have a phone plan anymore," she said. "They cut it off yesterday." Nathan didn't answer. The silence grew heavy between them. Clara stood, picked up her purse and whispered, "I can't do this." Then she left. He stood there for a long time after she was gone, staring at the empty doorway. The city outside was alive. Cars, laughter, life. But inside the room, there was only stillness. He sat down slowly, his hands gripping his knees, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt small. Back in Eastwood, Margaret was writing again. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate. She wrote letters she didn't intend to send. To Nathan, to Frank, to herself. She wrote about loneliness, about motherhood, about how love can turn into a quiet kind of grief that never fully leaves you. She wrote, "The world doesn't notice when you fade, but it does when you rise again." She closed the notebook and placed it beside her cup of tea. The rain had started again, light and steady. She imagined Nathan walking through Paris, his shoes soaking, his wallet empty. For a fleeting moment, she felt sorry for him. But sorrow was a luxury she could no longer afford. The next day, she received another call, this time from an investigator at the bank. He confirmed what Richard had said. Legal action would proceed if she wished. "We'll need your signature, ma'am," he said. "Once you file, he'll be served notice internationally." Margaret hesitated, pen in hand. The paper before her felt heavy with consequence. She thought of Nathan's face as a boy, covered in frosting from his 6th birthday cake. She thought of how he used to hold her hand when crossing the street. She thought of how far they had drifted, not in miles, but in the silent distance between love and betrayal. Then, slowly, she signed her name. Across the sea, Nathan received the notice 2 weeks later. The envelope was pale, official-looking, with his mother's name printed in neat black letters at the top. For a long time, he didn't open it. When he finally did, his hands shook. Each line felt like a knife. Fraud investigation, asset recovery, potential criminal charges. He sank into the bed, the paper trembling in his grip. He wanted to call her, to explain, to beg, to fight, but he didn't know what to say. What could he possibly say to a woman whose love he had treated like an old coat, worn and discarded? Clara never returned. Beatrice sent a short message, "You reap what you sow." Nathan stopped going out. He spent his days pacing the apartment, watching the rain fall over Paris. The city that had once felt like a dream now seemed distant, cold. Margaret, meanwhile, was changing in small but certain ways. She began walking every evening through the quiet streets of her town. People greeted her again. She started to smile, not often, but sometimes. She bought herself a new chair, painted the living room a pale green. These were little victories, but they mattered. And yet, each night, when the house grew quiet again, she would sit at the window, cup of tea in hand, and whisper to the dark, "Do you think of me, Nathan?" Somewhere far away, a man sat in a dimly lit apartment, staring at the same kind of night sky. And though he didn't hear her voice, he felt it, that faint ache in his chest that reminded him of something pure he had broken. Margaret didn't know it yet, but the story wasn't over. The wound had only just begun to open. Winter had come quietly to Eastwood. The leaves that once danced along Margaret Street now lay pressed flat under frost. The town had slowed, as though holding its breath. Margaret spent her mornings wrapped in a wool shawl, sitting by the window, watching the pale light crawl over the rooftops. It had been 3 months since she filed the case, and silence had followed. A long, waiting silence that felt both peaceful and cruel. She didn't speak of it to anyone. People in town noticed her more these days, the cashier at the grocery store, the neighbor who waved from across the street. They said things like, "You look different, Maggie. Lighter." She would smile politely, say thank you, and carry her groceries home. But no one knew what still burned quietly behind that calm exterior. One evening, Richard stopped by with papers in hand. His face was drawn with fatigue. "They reached out," he said. "From Paris. Your son's lawyer is requesting a settlement. He wants to return the funds. No legal action. Clean and simple." Margaret took the envelope from him, reading the typed pages. "He wants to return the money," she repeated softly. "Yes," Richard said, studying her face. "They're offering a full transfer. It could be done in days." She nodded, eyes still on the paper. "And that's it. That's it," he said. "You'll have your money. You can move on." Margaret smiled faintly. "Move on," she echoed. "Is that what people do when they're finished being broken?" Richard didn't answer. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes it's not about being whole again," he said quietly. "It's about learning to live with the cracks." After he left, Margaret sat in silence for a long time. The letter lay open before her. The words felt hollow. Numbers, legal terms, restitution. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been lost beyond money. She folded the paper neatly and placed it inside her drawer. That night, she couldn't bring herself to sleep. In Paris, Nathan sat in a small apartment that looked nothing like the one he had once shared with Clara. The walls were bare, the floor cold. He had sold the expensive furniture to pay the rent. He was thinner now, his eyes sunken, his hair longer. Every sound in the building echoed, footsteps, laughter, the clatter of dishes from another life that wasn't his. When the letter from his lawyer arrived, he read it twice, then again. He would return the money. It was the only thing left to do. But what haunted him wasn't the money, it was the silence. His mother hadn't called, hadn't written, hadn't even cursed his name. She had simply vanished from his world, as though she had never existed. And that, somehow, hurt more than any punishment. He wanted to write to her, to explain, to beg, but words felt meaningless now. He had built his life on lies, and words had always been his tools, soft, convincing, hollow. What could he possibly say that she hadn't already heard? One night, he sat at a small desk, opened an empty notebook, and began to write anyway. "Dear Mama," he wrote, "I don't know how to start, because I don't know who I am anymore without your forgiveness. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought money could fix what time had taken from us. But I was wrong. You gave me love, and I repaid you with greed. I can't take it back, but I can try to make it right." He stopped there, staring at the words. His hands were trembling. He tore out the page, folded it, and placed it inside an envelope addressed to Eastwood. Then he hesitated. Shame tightened his chest. What if she never opened it? What if she had already erased him from her heart? In the end, he mailed it anyway. Weeks passed before Margaret received the letter. It arrived on a quiet afternoon, tucked among bills and advertisements. When she saw his handwriting, her breath caught. For a long moment, she couldn't bring herself to open it. She placed it on the table, made herself a cup of tea, and sat down. Then, with trembling fingers, she unfolded the paper. As she read, her eyes blurred with tears she had sworn she wouldn't shed again. His words were clumsy, but honest, soaked in regret. There was no excuse, only pain. When she finished, she set the letter down and pressed it to her chest. For a brief moment, she let herself remember his laughter, his warmth, the little boy who had once promised to take her flying. She whispered, "I forgive you," but the words sounded fragile, like glass about to break. That night, she wrote back. "Dear Nathan," she began, "I don't hate you. Hate is heavy, and I've carried enough weight in my life. I wanted you to understand that love is not something you can buy, and loss is not something you can steal. I forgive you, but forgiveness does not erase what's been done. I wish you peace, wherever you are." She signed it, sealed it, and mailed it the next morning. By the time her letter reached Paris, Nathan was gone. The landlord said he had left suddenly, leaving only a few boxes behind. No forwarding address, no contact. The apartment was empty, except for one notebook left open on the desk. The last line written inside it said, "I wanted to make things right, but I was too late." No one knew where he went. Back in Eastwood, Margaret continued her walks. She spent her evenings reading by the window, her tea cooling beside her. Sometimes she imagined Nathan sitting somewhere under the same sky, holding her letter in his hands. Other times, she convinced herself he was safe, that he had found peace in some quiet corner of the world. But deep down, a small voice whispered that she might never see him again. Spring came and went. The snow melted, flowers bloomed. Life went on as it always does. One morning, she received a final envelope, this one from the French authorities. Inside was a short message confirming the closure of the investigation, and attached to it was a note written in another hand. Case terminated upon the death of the subject. Nathan Hayes, deceased, March 14th, Paris. For a long time, she didn't move. The words blurred before her eyes. She folded the letter carefully and set it down on the table. Her hands were steady, but her heart was a storm. She rose, walked to the window, and looked out at the sky. The day was bright, painfully bright. She whispered, "You took me flying after all." Then she sat down in her chair, holding the letter close, and let the silence fill the room, not the silence of loss, but the kind that comes when the story has said everything it needed to say. Outside, the wind carried the scent of spring. Inside, the clock ticked on, steady and eternal. The house felt emptier after the news. Margaret didn't weep. She had no tears left. Grief had long ago hollowed her out, leaving only the echo of what once was. Yet the silence that followed Nathan's death was different. It wasn't the silence of anger or betrayal anymore. It was the silence that settles over fields after a long storm, where nothing grows for a while, but everything finally rests. She walked through the small rooms of her home, touching things absently, the photo on the mantel of Nathan as a boy holding a paper airplane, the old apron she still kept folded on a chair, the clock that ticked out the same rhythm of her lonely years. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the whisper of her breath, the hum of the refrigerator. Life, it seemed, went on even when heart stopped. Days turned into weeks. Letters came from the bank, from Richard, from old neighbors who had heard bits of a story through whispers and pity. They wrote words like "Stay strong," and "You deserve peace," but Margaret didn't reply. What could she say? Words had become too small to hold the weight of what she had lived through. Instead, she found herself writing in her old recipe notebook again, not recipes this time, but fragments of thought. "Forgiveness is not release," she wrote one night. It's a surrender to the truth that some wounds do not close. She began to walk to the park each morning, moving slower than before, her cane tapping gently against the pavement. Children played in the distance. Their laughter floated like music from another world. She watched them quietly, remembering the way Nathan's laughter once sounded, bright and wild, like bells ringing after rain. Sometimes she would smile to herself, though the smile never reached her eyes. In early summer, Richard visited again. He looked older too, his hair grayer, his steps slower. "You've been hard to reach," he said gently. Margaret nodded. "I've been quiet," she replied. He handed her an envelope, the final transfer, the settlement Nathan had arranged before his death. "He did return it," Richard said. "Every last cent." Margaret stared at the papers, her eyes unfocused. "I don't need it," she murmured. "It was never about the money." "I know," Richard said softly. "But it's yours, Margaret. It always was." She thanked him, though her voice was barely a whisper. After he left, she placed the envelope in the same drawer where she had once kept Nathan's first report card, his letters from college, and now his death notice. She closed it gently, as if sealing a lifetime into a box. That night, she dreamed of water. She stood at the edge of a Seine, the lights of Paris flickering like candles on the surface. Nathan was there, standing just out of reach, his face calm, his voice low. "I thought I'd fly," he said, "but I fell." Margaret stepped closer, her hand trembling. "You flew, my boy," she whispered. "You just didn't know where to land." When she woke, tears had dried on her cheeks. Autumn came, and with it, the ache in her bones deepened. Her doctor suggested rest, medication, care. But Margaret only smiled politely and said she had all the care she needed. She stopped going to town as often. The neighbors noticed the lights in her window, dimming earlier each night. Sometimes, Doris, the woman from 2 doors down, would bring soup, knock, and leave it on the porch. Margaret always returned the bowl cleaned with a note that said, "Thank you." Inside, the house began to gather dust again. Books lay open, cups half-filled, time seeming to slow to a soft blur. One evening, as the sky turned amber, she sat in her favorite armchair, a knitted blanket around her shoulders, and opened Nathan's last letter once more. The paper was creased now, the ink slightly faded. She read it slowly, as though every word might change if she lingered long enough. "I can't fix what I broke," it said, "but I hope somewhere you're still proud that I was yours." She closed her eyes and pressed the paper to her lips. "Always," she whispered. For a while, she just sat there, listening to the wind rattling the trees outside, the faint echo of laughter from children down the street. Her breathing slowed, deep and even. The teacup on the table still steamed faintly. The clock on the wall ticked, steady as a heartbeat. When Doris knocked the next morning and got no answer, she tried again, then pushed the door open. The kettle was still warm. The blanket still draped over the chair. Margaret sat there, peaceful, her eyes closed, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips, the kind that comes when all battles are finally over. The letter lay in her lap. A single line was underlined in blue ink. "You took me flying after all." At her funeral, the church was small but filled. People from the town came, not out of pity but quiet respect. Richard stood at the back, his hat in his hands, eyes wet. Doris read a few words, her voice trembling. "She was a kind woman," she said. "A mother who gave everything and took nothing back." Afterward, they buried her under the oak tree behind the old chapel, the same tree where she used to sit as a girl, dreaming of leaving Eastwood. The sky was overcast, and a soft drizzle began to fall. Someone said, "It's like the heavens are weeping for her," but Richard shook his head. "No," he said. "It's her way of saying goodbye." In Paris, months later, a maintenance worker cleaning out the apartment where Nathan had lived found a small wooden box inside a drawer. Inside were 2 things, a faded photograph of Margaret holding him as a baby and a note written in his uneven hand. It said, "For when she forgives me, keep it safe." The worker didn't know what it meant, but he placed it carefully on the windowsill, letting the morning sun fall over it. And somewhere, in the quiet of eternity, a mother and son finally found their way back to each other. Not through words, not through wealth, but through the kind of love that survives even its own destruction. The wind moved softly through the trees that day, carrying with it the scent of rain and memory. And in that hush, if one listened closely, it almost sounded like wings.